Well, the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption released findings this week which have sent shockwaves through New South Wales and the federal government and indeed through the Labor Party itself. I'm here today with Dr Mike Pottinger and Olivia Monaghan from the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Arts to discuss what's happened in the last week and maybe put some context and some analysis around it. Thank you both for spending some time with me today. We might start with you, Olivia. What actually have we learned from the ICAC this week?
I think ultimately what we've learned is that no state in Australia is really safe from corruption at the moment. Up until recently, New South Wales had been viewed as being one of the cleaner states following the huge clean-up in the 1990s, and widely regarded by most other anti-corruption organisations in Australia as being the most successful. So I think what we've seen above anything else is that the New South Wales ICAC still knows how to do its job, and also that corruption is still alive and well.
Alive and well. We've seen findings against two former Labor ministers, in this case New South Wales Labor ministers, and the recommendation that the other authorities should act on these allegations of corruption. Is that right?
Yes, so it's now been referred off to the DPP and they'll be investigating further along with some people who will also be investigating. I think it's the Securities and Investments Commission as well, and so from there we'll see charges made, or potentially see charges made.
Mike, I might ask you, this has obviously become a bit of a political football. We're in a federal election year, it involves Labor politicians, it's a perfect storm in some ways. The opposition leader, Tony Abbott, is trying to make a bit of hay and link these woes that have been affecting state Labor with that of the federal Labor government. Putting that to one side, I guess, a little bit, do the findings of the ICAC tell us much, or can they tell us anything about the broader context here of the Labor Party?
Well, it's an interesting question and a good question, given that the report itself doesn't really go into much detail on the structure of the ALP. That's not what it's an investigation into, as much as the opposition leader's press conference yesterday might suggest it, and much of the talk since then in the media has been about the ALP being rotten to the core. This report is in fact very much about the behaviour of several key individuals. Now, obviously, these individuals were associated with and involved in the ALP. What it does suggest is that some of the recommendations of internal reviews from the ALP that have been conducted over, certainly in recent years, as recent as 2010, going right back to 2001, those recommendations, particularly many of them that haven't been implemented, might be instrumental in helping to clean up, so to speak, some of the problems that the ALP is currently facing. I think one of the things to bear in mind is that although the report itself is looking at individuals, and so far a lot of the rhetoric in the media from both political parties has been about cleaning up and getting rid of a problem that is rotten to the core, that sort of draws attention to a problem of a bad individual, or maybe a large number of bad individuals, but it detracts from the broader systematic problems or weaknesses in a party structure or any political or organisational structure. There are examples of this that we can look at, quite specific examples. In the 2010 review conducted by Faulkner and Carr and Brax, they laid out a raft of recommendations designed to address, amongst other things, the integrity of the party. And some of those recommendations were things like having direct election of the ALP executive, having the ALP intervene in pre-selection only as a last resort, and even then only under extreme circumstances, and another which was designed to change the way that the party voted on candidates for election or for pre-selection, to remove or diminish the role of the factional system in doing that. Now, those were just three of a number of recommendations. The first two of them were struck down or rejected outright at the party's next national conference. The third of them was, if I understand this correctly, accepted as an option, so branches could choose to accept that reformed way of electing members, or candidates I should say. But the safeguards that were recommended with those reforms to ensure that ALP members or those controlling large numbers of votes weren't able to manipulate the voting process, those safeguards were not implemented. So the reforms that they'd recommended, which were designed really to do two things: to make sure that those with large numbers of votes weren't able to unduly influence the process, but also to try and restore a sense of confidence at the local level or at a grassroots level in the party. I think it's fair to say that both Brax, Faulkner and Carr, all three of them, were pretty disappointed with that outcome. So now might be an opportunity, perhaps, regardless of the politics of the matter, for the ALP to try and really move forward with those kinds of recommendations and make some real progress in reform. We've heard in recent weeks the Prime Minister come out and say that he's going to clean up the New South Wales branch of the ALP, but until now, as far as I'm aware, we haven't seen much concrete action
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear it in that broader context, because when the Prime Minister did come out, he initially put a deadline of, I think, 30 days for the New South Wales branch to clean itself up, and the rhetoric was very strong. But it obviously seems like we do have other possible responses to these long-running issues which have already been on the table. The idea of someone standing up, and we can discard the political considerations of Kevin Rudd trying to inoculate himself and the rest, but the idea of turning around to an organisation like the Labor Party and saying, you have 30 days to clean yourself up, does that have any basis? Can we put any faith in a process like that?
I would suggest it's highly problematic. You can understand why it was done, aside from the context in which Kevin Rudd came into saying that. The ALP obviously wants to come out with a sense of strong leadership, and they want to say this is what we'll do and this is how we're going to do it. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, it's a long-running problem, and a long-running problem often requires greater investigation and understanding than a 30-day deadline. And I believe the 30-day deadline was to come up with a plan and to oust corrupt or unprofessional people within the party. And quite simply, I think that, speak up if you think I'm wrong, but I think that 30 days is too tight a deadline to do that effectively. Perhaps if it was 30 days to formulate a plan or a strategy which then gets followed through and not flowed through another commission or another bureaucratic step, then that would be a good way to go about it. But I would like to see, some rhetoric that is actually followed up with action, and I think that's...
I'm inclined to agree that doing something like saying, okay, 30 days, find everyone who's corrupt,
it sounds
bring
very
them out
impressive,
the front.
doesn't
It
it?
sounds very impressive, and this is actually a perennial problem with anti-corruption policy in general. Anti-corruption policy is not really terribly exciting. When you talk about making serious reforms that are going to, exactly what Olivia's talking about, that are going to address long-running problems and that will prevent these problems in the future, we're talking about really dry reforms like changes to the way a particular candidate is elected or pre-selected, changes to the rules and regulations within a party or within a government structure about what you can or can't do, codes of conduct. No one gets very excited by these sorts of things.
It's not like on television.
It's not like on television, and it's not the kind of thing where if you come forward and you have a press conference and you say, okay, here are these 37 recommendations from previous reviews, as of now we will start implementing, that doesn't sound terribly strong. So I understand that maybe the drive to come out and say, 30 days, round everyone up, bring them to us, might have been done out of an effort to appear strong and commanding, and perhaps that's been successful. Whether it's possible to do so or not, I think, is almost in some ways besides the point. The problem is what's going to be done about the broader problems and the broader concerns.
And of course, like I mentioned earlier, that's largely been seen as an attempt by Kevin Rudd. Now that we have these findings coming out, he can say, well, I've already started a process. We're cleaning it up. I've changed this. I've ordered that. We're going to directly elect the leader. There's all these ways the ALP is changing and can therefore deflect questions and criticism.
It's interesting to think, there's been a lot of talk in the media about to what extent will federal Labor be tarred with the same brush as state Labor in the wake of this? What effect will it have on the election? Now, and I should say up front that I'm not an expert in Labor polling or in their chances at the upcoming election. But I can see a number of ways that this could play out. One would be to say, well, in Australia, I think there's some truth to the generalisation that in Australia people are pretty cynical about politicians already. Yeah. So perhaps most people will be sort of shrugging their shoulders. And in a way, a lot of the media coverage of this has said explicitly, no surprises here, pretty much what we expected all along. So maybe much in the same way that in commercial markets, bad news for a company that is expected is already sort of factored into a share price. We may find that this news, as big as it has really been factored into Labor's polling already, or Labor's popularity already. The other thing that I'm wondering is whether, and I raise this because of what you're saying about Kevin Rudd immunising himself, trying to inoculate himself against the criticism, I wonder if that might actually bizarrely play into some of Kevin Rudd's popularity. He seems to be popular amongst a large proportion of the population. The narrative that seems to be forming around his return to power is that Kevin Rudd is now back and things are back on track again. And I wonder if this might actually strengthen what otherwise could have seemed like a hollow attempt to say, and I'm really going to clean things up. Now there's actually a scandal to latch onto. I'm not convinced that it's going to lead to a surge in popularity by any measure, but nor am I convinced that this is suddenly going to swing really heavily against the ALP. I think that's partly why the opposition have been trying quite heavily over the last day or so to really connect federal ALP to the scandal.
Well, I think at the end of the day, this Obeid scandal has been waiting to come to a close since the first hearing was back in February. Yeah. So Kevin would have come back in knowing that he had to, or that the federal ALP had to make a stance on corruption, distance themselves from the state ALP in New South Wales. So it's perhaps no surprise that he did come in and the first thing he said was, we're going to clean up and, we're going to distance ourselves from New South Wales, but at the same time we have a duty of care to them, essentially. But I think the issue of cynicism that you raised is also interesting, because it can distance people from becoming involved in politics.
Absolutely.
And similarly, people within the ALP or people within any organisation where there's cynicism, they're faced with cynicism against what they're doing, or they have cynicism towards the processes, that can in turn foster corrupt conduct.
Absolutely.
Because you have no faith, no real sense of duty or anything like that. So there
You're
is
not
this
buying into the process. You don't have
Yeah,
that
you
sense of
don't-
ownership and
you don't have a
responsibility.
exactly.
And as we know from the context of police corruption in particular, in areas where police are having to deal with a problem that can't be fixed, often when they're dealing with illegal narcotics, for example, the kind of cynicism that seeps into the day-to-day life of a police officer is often fundamental in their beginning to engage in misconduct and corruption. I think the point Liv makes is really important. And if you think about the way that works within a political party structure, if you have everybody coming in at the grassroots level, either becoming alienated and leaving, or working out how to play the game the way it is played, that's not a great recipe for building candidates of great integrity.